and perhaps more appropriately was charged with running this Franco-British summit on the UK side, so has first-hand experience of it. So without further ado, Peter, I'm going to kick off with you and say, are you pleased with how it went?
So yes, I am, Anand, and I'm particularly pleased because I just don't take these things for granted. It was 5 years since our last summit in 2018. President Macron, when he met Prime Minister Sunak in Bali, suggested in public after a conversation that they'd had, a very good conversation they'd had in private, that doing a summit in the first quarter of this year would be a good idea. But until these things happen, you just cannot take it for granted, either that it will happen at all, or that it will lead to a fruitful result. And, you know, the first thing is meeting in person and meeting extensively in person in private in the way that the two men did. They had over an hour together is a really big thing. Secondly, the declaration, we can talk about that, but and I helped draft it, so I'm massively invested. So some honest feedback from others would be very welcome. But as somebody massively invested in it, I was really pleased by how much we managed to pack into it. It's a full spectrum summit. And then the third thing, and I think perhaps most importantly of all, was this is just the beginning. This establishes a pattern of dialogue which should be normal and natural between us, but got to be honest, that has fallen into abeyance. And so one of the fun things about preparing this summit was how many people who hadn't been talking to each other but wanted to talk to each other started to do so again.
Wonderful, thanks, Peter. Alice, can I come to you next? Are you as positive as Peter is about what came out of the summit?
I am, and first of all, congratulations to Peter for all the work that has been put into this. It's been a long time coming. Well, both sides really, needed to talk to each other and were struggling. So I was very happy to see the summit. I think it's definitely a success in terms of the détente, sort of renormalizing the relationship between the two countries, rebuilding trust. We also needed the good optics, and I think there was a very conscious and clear choice to get along. And also maybe to avoid touching on a few issues that we know we disagree. Obviously AUKUS was put aside and we've moved on from that. The question about how the UK works with the EU on, for instance, security and defense was just alluded to in the declaration, but not more. And I think it is a win for both Sunak and Macron. And I think the focus on the European political community, and it'd be good to come back to it, is particularly interesting. And I think the declaration is a very comprehensive work plan. I didn't necessarily expect such a long document because, I was sort of toying between, is it going to be a short, sort of to the point document? Is it going to be a comprehensive list? I think it says a lot about the number of things the two countries want to talk about together. To me, it really read as sort of a shared concerns and diagnosis of the two globally minded European powers trying to deliver together for Europe and also for global objectives. And I think that's really what comes through in the document, trying to have joint leadership, but that goes beyond just French and British interests, really delivering for Europe on Ukraine, but also on the Indo-Pacific, and trying to tackle a whole range of challenge, be it on Iran, North Korea. So it's a very, very rich document. I think the only thing that for me came through it is that sense of a little bit of a glass ceiling in terms of what the two countries can do together, where they don't have sort of joint mechanisms. So obviously France has, wants to move on a number of things through the EU. How the UK engages with that is still a bit TBD, but I think we'll probably come back to that in the discussion. I think lots of very interesting things on security and defense, lots of coordination, and this idea to agree to coordinate more, to debate more. It really feels like a strong basis for more working groups, more strategic dialogue, and maybe a revoyure in 1 year's time to see where we have made progress or not. So I'm very positive about the document, and I'm sure colleague will dive into where we still have questions. But overall, I think it was a much needed reset.
Georgie, I saw you nodding. So are you revoltingly positive about all this as well?
I mean, no, I share completely Alice's assessment, and well done, Peter, and and to your French counterparts, because it is an interesting document. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there on defence, which, as Alice said, and I'm sure we'll come back to, on energy cooperation. I mean, for France, it's particularly important to have an ally on nuclear, and the UK has been traditionally ally on nuclear. And I think given the tensions in Franco-German discussions on nuclear, it was really important that that was in there. The EU is no longer a taboo that it once was. So again, I think there are some positive things there for France. I mean, and also, as Peter said, you know, one of the consequences of Brexit is just there are fewer opportunities for French and British diplomats to meet. So they used to meet a lot in Brussels, in the margins. I don't want to exaggerate that, because a lot of the Franco-British especially defence side of things happened outside of EU structures, but still they used to meet more regularly. And so you have to kind of rebuild that, find a new way of working together. And I think there's a lot of ambition in that paper, of lots of discussions from cyber to finance, where we'll be meeting regularly, different ministries as well, you know, the Treasury and Le Trésor in France. So all of that is good. I think the French government, at least people I've spoken to, are positive. I think French kind of policy watchers are a bit more, not critical, but I think they sort of feel that the next summit is the one that matters, because there's a lot of ambition in there, but actually the stuff that has, like, the actual deliverables are quite technical and they're very precise. There's a sense that actually the only real deliverable was around small boats, which was obviously a very big British demand, but wasn't so much a French demand. So I think there's a little bit of regret that there wasn't more in terms of deliverables in there. But I think small steps to rebuild trust. But I think the next summit really is the one that everyone, I think, should be watching out for, because that's when we'll see whether or not this actually rebuilding of trust is actually delivered.
Excellent, thank you. And Richard, last but not least, what are your thoughts on how this?
I mean, I think as an outsider, it looked great fun, actually, and the optics were fantastic. I mean, not just between the leaders, but also some of the press coverage. I mean, I don't think I'll ever forget the front page of Libération and its royal wedding style mug showing Macron and Sunak inside a heart. So, I mean, clearly, you know, it was very successful in terms of the public diplomacy element. And it obviously ranks as a success in its own terms in having the summit, you know, after 5 years and marking the end of what is an Olympic-style diplomatic sulk, I think. So, I mean, it really is significant in those terms. I mean, really, to pick up on a point that Georgie made, I think it was an important summit, but not a landmark summit, in the sense that we've obviously had previous Anglo-French summits, which have really set out a very expansive agenda, and you might say our historic Lancaster House, obviously, being the most memorable. But I think what's important for me is that we've kept the relationship alive with the military-to-military links, and that's provided for in a great deal of detail through the Lancaster House structures. What happens here, as I read this declaration, it's trying to sort of broaden the relationship. We never have anything that looks like the Franco-German relationship in terms of the institutional relationship and so on, but it has the potential, if there's the follow-through on all of these aspects of the summit, to give it more breadth perhaps than we've had previously, and to give it a different feel and tenor. One other takeaway for me is what's striking when you read foreign policy, the foreign policy bits, is how much concurrence there is, both in reading the world, but also in terms of the coincidental interests that the UK and France have. And that's one of the things that makes that document so long, I think, Peter, if I may say so, because there's so much in there. It's almost an encyclical, I think, to remind us of the areas in which there is agreement. And I guess my question would be, that's great. What about the areas in which there is disagreement? How do we work on those? But also, you know, how do you build on that? You know, how do you go beyond and through what structures, ways in which you can get effective and timely foreign policy coordination?
Very, very low bar here. We seem to be celebrating the fact that a French president and a British prime minister can sit in the same room without being rude to each other, which is clearly great, but it's not sort of massively aspirational. I mean, I'm just, how important is mood? I suppose is the question I have. There's clearly a new mood around Franco-British relations. There's clearly a degree of personal chemistry, not just between the leaders, but between various ministers as well. There's clearly a closeness there that wasn't there in the past. But, as has been hinted at, in terms of practical deliverables, outside of the small boats issue, there wasn't very much. I mean, does this really matter apart from sort of looking a bit better, do we think? Does the sort of, diplomatic mood have a real practical impact? Yeah, just chip in whenever you want, Peter.
Thanks, Anand. I mean, so look, seen from where I sit, mood, particularly mood of our leaders, does make a difference. You're right, both leaders took a decision to be friendly. That's a political decision, but it leads to real and concrete results. And so, Georgie, just to pick up what you were saying about small boats, I think that actually what was interesting about that was there was a recognition that we have a shared interest. It's not just, France doing Britain a favor. The language used in that was very much from the leaders directly themselves about partnership and about ending a problem rather than managing it. They actually used the word, and it was direct. It was a direct take from them. Break the problem. And the other way that you can see that that's a real partnership is we describe the issue as being an issue that stretches from the Channel through the Mediterranean and beyond. So there's a recognition that we each need to help each other. Now, if you only do this bottom up, and you never do it top down, then getting to that sense of shared interest and getting beyond, if you like, points of friction or how much we can get from each other, or at its worst, zero sum, it's quite hard to do that. And so if you have a mood which is leaders talking to each other in the very, very open way that the two leaders did. I mean, it's very, very unusual for President Macron to invite, I mean, maybe you'll tell me I'm wrong about this, but certainly it felt to me unusual that President Macron wanted to have a bilateral with Prime Minister Sunak, which was basically with just the two of them in the room. They called in officials right at the end to basically record what they've agreed. So in other words, it wasn't a friendly chat, it was an operational discussion which they wanted to memorialize, but they wanted to have that conversation themselves first, alone. And what that led to was this sense of very strong partnership, not only in migration, but also in defense, where the two leaders themselves move the debate along. And there is a big challenge on defense. I completely agree with Richard that, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. How do we manage to operationalize the kind of aspiration that we've set out here? But what we're basically saying to each other is we are the strongest military allies in Europe. We have a very, very strong shared interest in outcomes, but also in the kind of industrial cooperation that leads to outcomes. Can we now deliver on that? And I think that's a very big question. And then the third element of this is, as Anand, you said, an unusually strong series of ministerial relationships that back up that strong relationships with leaders. So if you look at Foreign Secretary Cleverly with Foreign Minister Colonna, for example, if you look at Braverman Darmanin, who incidentally talk to each other in French, if you look at Wallace Lecornu, etc., etc. These are strong relationships. The one relationship we weren't able to sort of, if you like, memorialize through the summit was Jeremy Hunt, Bruno Le Maire, because Jeremy Hunt was preparing the budget. But that is also a very strong and active relationship. And Georgie, you're quite right to point to the dialogue that's now been established with the Trésor. Again, sounds like diplomatic sort of language. It's like the routine stuff. It was a dialogue that didn't exist before. It's a dialogue that does exist now. That makes a difference. So it's a long way of saying, and I really do think that mood matters because it affects how officials can then move into a more cooperative space. If you don't have that, if you don't have ministers getting on, if you don't have leaders sending a very clear signal to their systems, then officials just basically, we tend to be more narrow. We need the galvanizing force of a summit. And by the way, it was Rishi Sunak's first bilateral summit ever as Prime Minister. So for us, that is epoch-making.
Okay, interesting. Does anyone else want to come in on this, on the importance of tone, style? Go on, Georgie.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say one of the things that I've really taken away from this summit is basically for the past 5 years, or at least 4 to 5 years, we've had really negative UK coverage in France. Every time the UK came up in conversation, it was largely negative, and that's partly a result of, Brexit, and then COVID, meaning just fewer opportunities to meet in person. Then you had AUKUS, and I mean, it's just like constantly spats and between the two countries, and following Friday, the whole kind of conversation, even in the media, is much more positive. It's about sort of, even Macron's use of it's a new start, it's renewed ambition. It's really, we are turning this page, and we're ready to start a new chapter. So I think that positive spin is really important. And also, it's not lost on the French that, they've had this is Rishi Sunak's first, the Prime Minister's first bilateral summit, but also then they have the King's visit. And so there's again this sense that actually France matters to the UK. So it's a nice kind of calendar, as they say, concours de circonstances, but it really works. Although I do suspect people will be more interested overall in the King's visit than they were in the summit, but that's beside the point. Very quickly on small boats, I mean, I don't think French people think that it's France doing the UK a favour. They just sense that it was very much something that was pushed on the British side. We've heard kind of, and even just the fact that the government had introduced this bill just before the summit, and there was, I think, a sense of regret that there wasn't more ambition in other areas. So there's a bit on defence, and Alice is much better qualified to talk about all of that, and she wrote a paper beforehand with some good recommendations. But I think there's just a sense of regret that what about, on the Middle East, on kind of the Indo-Pacific, it's all in there, but it's all ambition, and it's not actually, there are very limited concrete deliverables. And so that's why I said, I think that I don't personally share that assessment, but I think the next summit really matters because it will be the test.
Maybe just to comment on that and build on what's been said, I think, I mean, we all, want that narrative of a new chapter to be a reality. I think it matters as long as it lasts. And I think we all hope that this is a new chapter that is maybe a little bit more insulated from the ups and downs of national politics. Obviously, there'll be an election in the UK next year, but I don't think anyone is expecting, a new government, either a Labour one or hopefully even a Conservative one, to go back on that new relationship with France. And I think it's part of a trend of the UK government under Prime Minister Sunak, but also before, to try and re-engage with different partners in Europe and to try and find a sort of new normal post-Brexit. So hopefully this will be a little bit more protected from the ups and downs. But as we all know, the negotiations between the UK and the EU will sort of be on and on and on a lot of different topics. So the real question is, can we continue this détente and build on this agenda and not have to go back to the drawing board of are we friends or enemies? So I think that's the hope here. And then just in terms of the good mood, I think what's been really important and interesting is to see that there is, as I said, a sort of conscious choice to get along, at least so far, and to find ways to manage the competition between the two countries. Because obviously the past, I guess, hundreds of years, we've had Franco-British competition, but especially in the past 5 years, seeing the global Britain agenda develop was sometimes frustrating for the French. Seeing, the French try to have leadership on some European questions, maybe putting the Brits aside, was also frustrating. I think what we're seeing now is also maybe a more sort of mature relation between the two countries, also acknowledging that since Sandhurst and since 2018, the world has changed a lot, and they also have other partners that they work with. We've seen the refresh of the integrated review published yesterday. The UK is really strengthening its role as a Northern European security provider, Jeff being quite central to what the UK is trying to do, France focusing on the agenda of European strategic sovereignty. These things are not mutually exclusive, but these are not necessarily things that the two countries can do together. So I think what is important is about building bridges and sort of saying we may not do everything together, but as long as we're going in the same direction and we're building on sort of the same objectives, that's positive. And one small thing that I thought was positive in the text of the declaration, the mention of CGEF and how that sort of format can be used. I thought it was interesting, the mention of maybe considering it in the concept of the High North, which is something that obviously the UK is thinking about as part of GEF and its role as a Northern European security provider, and finding a bridge between a sort of UK-France format and what the UK is trying to do in Northern Europe was interesting. And in a similar way, having the UK in the integrated review refresh yesterday say, we'll try to align our Indo-Pacific work and strategy, not just with France, but also with the EU, was something that I thought was quite interesting. So maybe bottoms up, brick by brick, building bridges between what the two countries are trying to do. They may not do it together necessarily, but as long as it's going in the same direction, I think that's the sort of delivering for Europe and delivering for sort of those global objectives that the two countries agree on. And I think that's the most important. So it's not headline news, but I think in practice, it's a much more positive dynamic that we should try to keep.
Okay, Richard, do you want to come in on this, or shall?
Yeah, maybe to say something in connection to what Alice said and what Georgie said, and try and stitch them together. I mean, Alice's point about, the last 5 years have obviously there's been a huge amount of change in the context of the relationship, Brexit, obviously, but also the war in Ukraine. And the UK, gradually scoping out a sort of new European diplomacy, new European strategy for itself. And that does have an impact, obviously, on the relationship, because it's not quite 5 wasted years, of course, because the military to military and the nuclear relationship has rolled on. But, I wonder, and I'll be interested in colleagues' thoughts on this, because the UK sort of disappeared a bit from France's thinking about Europe. How is it being reconnected, if you like, in terms of France's worldview? But also on Georgie's point about the sort of deliverables, because of course, one of the really striking things, if you look at particularly on the defence industrial side, is that the gains there have been pretty modest. I mean, there's a very good partnership there on missiles, with one MDNA. But if you were to say, look at this comparison to the 70s, where we had programs like Jaguar and we had the helicopter programs and so on, there isn't anything like the sort of interconnectedness on defence industrial programs that was there. And now the UK has other options, such as AUKUS, for example, where there was at one point talk of an Anglo-French submarine program, but obviously that's long in the past. So I think, some of those sinews to the relationship, which were much stronger in the past, are going to be very difficult to renew. And as Alice said, the UK's got other things going on. I mean, Jeff versus CJEF doesn't really bear a decent comparison one with the other, not least because Jeff is great at publicising what it does. I mean, and CJEF, in terms of what it's for and how it's to be used, doesn't compare in the same way. And working that through and the commitment to do that, I think, is obviously important if it's going to remain a meaningful construct. So for me, down the road is, and this is, I think, raised very much by the integrated review refresh, where does France sit in the broader landscape of European relationships for the UK? It's obviously an important and significant relationship, but how important and significant is it in comparison to, say, a relationship with Poland, which has taken on much more significance since 2022, but even before then?
Brilliant, thank you. Right, we've had loads of questions. And do put your questions in on Slido. And actually, if you want to be very kind, do vote for the questions you want me to pose to the panel, because that makes my life a lot easier. What I'm going to do is start taking some of these questions, and I'm going to be a bit brutal in the sense that I'm not going to ask all 4 of you to reply to each one. Otherwise, we're going to be here till Christmas. So if you particularly want to chip in on any of these questions, do so. I mean, the first one, so I'm going to rephrase, is how different would this summit have been had we not had the Windsor framework beforehand? I mean, to what extent would a failure to have sorted Northern Ireland have got in the way of this summit? That's a nice, easy one.
Do you want me to come in on that, Anand, or do you want to go hand that over to one other member?
Always welcome, Peter. Always welcome.
So just to tell you what it felt like from my point of view, I mean, obviously, the Windsor framework is a good thing. It's something that, a lot of our European partners have said to us very clearly they wanted us to sort out. It was a conversation between us and the Commission. But I have to tell you that in preparation for the summit itself, although clearly this was a sort of background thing, it wasn't conditional. In other words, we decided that we were going to have a summit together, and we fixed the date and we announced the date of the summit before we knew what the outcome of the negotiation with the EU would be. However, we absolutely recognise that sorting out an issue that is of concern, not only to our partners, but also very much to the UK, is a helpful thing to do. So it wasn't conditional, but it helped. I just wanted to very briefly, this is cheeky, but I'm going to do it anyway. I wanted to very briefly to come back to the defence question, because I think what Richard says is very interesting. And I think what you've all said about sort of, if you like, looking forward to the next summit and looking forward to what we do. The one thing that really struck me in preparing for all of this was that we do with France, and this is quite unusual, through the Lancaster House mechanism, we have a mechanism for preparing these summits on the defence and foreign policy side that is extensive. So all of these people have to, through a structure, come together. And one of the things that I learned through it was quite how extensive the CGEF cooperation is. In other words, you're absolutely right, Richard, we do talk more about the GEF, but the CGEF is something very, very unusual. So to give you one very concrete example, because of the interoperability that's created through CGEF, we can exchange blood on the battlefield with French troops. We cannot do that with any other country in the world. And I think that's about the most concrete illustration I can have of why this thing is meaningful. What we are going to begin to do is to think more about how we badge CGEF as well as we badge GEF. But what really occurred to me was that the amount that we're doing through CGEF and the kind of interoperability that CGEF is leading to is not much talked about, but it's real.
Okay, excellent. We've got a few questions on this, sort of looking forward. Should the illegal migration bill go through, and should it indeed be shown to be illegal, so in breach of our international commitments? And even further down the line, should we end up leaving the European Court of Human Rights? Should we pull out of that agreement? Would that have a massive impact on our relationship with France? And indeed with other European states, but let's focus on France for now.
Shall I have a go? And
yep, more the merrier.
I think so. I'm not an expert in migration or immigration law, so I'm going to be quite upfront about that. When I asked French people about the bill just before the summit, there was this sense of, well, you know, this is the UK government's, it's like its sovereign decision. It might look very different once it's gone through Parliament. The one thing Brexit has taught us that we need to wait and see what Parliament does. The fact that the government's rushing this through Parliament might make them revisit that assumption. But there was this sense of kind of, let's be calm about this and not sort of jump to conclusions, and also a recognition that this was a really important and salient issue for the whole of the UK. So I think there is that sort of at the back of the mind. So we'll have to wait and see. You know, if the UK pulled out, yeah, possibly, but I think the summit has shown, because of course we're talking about, you know, this bill being introduced just before the summit, and then the Prime Minister literally flying out from Paris, I think is right, Peter, to San Diego for the AUKUS summit. And there was maybe a little bit, but anyway, they followed each other. And I think, you know, France knew this was happening, and still there was this willingness to turn the page. And as Alice said, there will always be differences and divergent positions, but there's a willingness to try and work with what we have and realize that the last 5 years shouldn't really happen again, especially when there's war in Europe and that we share many of the same European and global ambitions and everything else. So I think there's going to be an attempt to try as much as possible to not let it go to the stage of diplomatic round, try and resolve things. But I think they're watching it, but they're being sort of cautious about, and we'll just have to wait and see how it goes.
Okay, brilliant. Do you think, does this usher in a sort of new period of stronger bilateral ties with lots of European states? Are we going to try and do the same thing with the Germans, for instance? Do we think this new tone that we see under Rishi Sunak will extend to some of those other key bilaterals as well? I'm trying not to...
I think, yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I feel like it started already with some European countries, and I think maybe on some specific policy areas, obviously with some countries in sort of northern, eastern, the Baltic partners on security and defense more specifically. I think the FCDO has been working on a stronger cooperation with Italy for a while, which had been in part blocked by Brexit-related tensions, and I think there is now an appetite to move forward. So I think, for instance, Italy could be a country that we're hearing more about going forward, and I think there is this appetite to sort of rebuild those bridges and to sort of start from a new position, and not, I don't want to frame everything as post-Brexit, because it's also post a lot of different things at this stage, but really say, okay, now it's a new page, new chapter, and in a way no matter who comes next, as British Prime Minister, we've re-established relations with our neighbours and partners that can sort of withstand political changes and shocks and ongoing discussion with the EU. And I think that's where we should be looking at going forward. So I mean, Peter will know that better than I do what's next on his to-do list and agenda, but I assume that this is part of the engagement that we'll see, and that I think also the British government want us to focus on. I mean, what was quite striking in the refresh yesterday, and I saw a lot of people commenting on that, was that map of Europe, sort of saying, look, we're actually engaging with Europe, because a critic of the previous iteration of the integrated review was to say, well, actually, you've forgotten about Europe. There is a sort of Europe or EU-shaped hole in the review. So I think it's about being quite didactic and saying, listen, we're actually doing more, we're engaging more, this is important and we know it. So I think this is something that we'll see more of going forward.
Did you want
so
to
just very briefly, Anand, I think you're absolutely right, Alice. And to quote Anand's favourite document, the Integrated Review Refresh, if you go to page 22, paragraph 13, it actually cites the UK-France summit. I'm particularly pleased about this because it was some nimble footwork after the summit had finished. We did not write this before the summit had started. It was basically saying that, building on the summit, we do want to establish wider prime ministerial and ministerial engagement with other European partners. And it also says in paragraph 14 on page 22, I'm saving you having to read the whole thing, Anand, it memorializes what we have managed to achieve through the summit with France. So we absolutely do want to do this bilaterally, but we also, in paragraph 15, talk about our relationship with the EU itself through the TCA. So we want to do this with the EU, we want to do this bilaterally. There's lots and lots of stuff we do, and fundamentally through the integrated review runs this very, very clear thread, which is we want to and need to work closely with the countries who share not just our interests, but also our values. And if we're going to do that, then it makes sense to start with our nearest neighbours.
I have to say, Peter, if it's over 1,000 words, I struggle. That's just where I am with long documents. But I mean, this raises a whole load of interesting questions, one of which I suppose is, does Brexit get in the way? And if so, where? I mean, we've seen the thing about a returns agreement and the French saying, don't talk to us, talk to Brussels. This is an EU-wide thing. I'd imagine that the European Defence Fund limits the degree to which we can work with partners now because of its ridiculously restrictive, French-inspired, I should say, rules about external participation. But are there areas where we run into a Brexit wall despite our best efforts to work closely with our partners bilaterally?
So, and just to come in very quickly on this, and others will want to comment, but I mean, what you see in the joint declaration is we just need to talk this stuff through. So, in the defence language, there's a reiteration of a commitment made at Sandhurst about market access that's repeated in the following paragraph, and that is very important to us. If we're going to build the kind of industrial cooperation we need to achieve together, then obviously we're going to need to do that through markets that are as open as possible. And it's also true that on the migration piece, we talk, again, using language from the Calais group, about collectively talking to the European Union about this, because obviously we do have to, and obviously we recognise that there are areas that are EU competence, although obviously there are also areas that are not EU competence and that countries can choose to change nationally. So we absolutely recognise that part of this conversation is about how we jointly and separately approach the EU. We also think there is plenty that we can do bilaterally that is not dependent on things that have EU competence. So it's not either or, it's both and.
Okay, does anyone else want to chip in on this? We agree to it, Brexit intrudes on bilateral cooperation?
Maybe just very briefly in terms of the things that were not in the very comprehensive document. I thought the paragraph about the Sandhurst summit in 2018 and the fact that the UK and France had agreed on finding a way of linking the UK with EU defense toolkit, industrial tools, etc. was particularly interesting. It's just reading the paragraph is quite confusing in itself because it's very, very vague. And I thought it was really interesting because in the integrated review refresh, you do have a mention of PESCO, which I thought was interesting, but in the UK-France Joint Declaration, no mention of PESCO, the EDF, the EDA. You really feel like this is sort of a tough thing. We need to discuss it through, but maybe, again, this is one of those things that's sort of put on the side for now, because focus of really by that discussion, and there will be a discussion to have between the EU and the UK, building on the Windsor framework goodwill, and maybe this government or the next, maybe we can do more together in a more structured way. But these are tough sort of issues that we don't necessarily want to talk about right now. So I thought it was quite interesting how interestingly vague that paragraph was on a topic where we could have expected more. But again, this is a topic where we know famously the two countries not necessarily disagree, but at least agree to disagree and are on very different pages. And there is industrial competition. There will be big questions coming up, but I think this is the type of thing that we'll be discussing between this summit and the next, and that all the sort of working groups will be working on. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just that's not where the focus was. And I think everyone is well aware of the divergences and competition that the two countries have, and they're not disappearing. It's just about managing them better. And hopefully this is a sign that type of discussion can happen. Maybe not under the public eye now, but there is something to be said.
Okay, I remember being struck, I think it was the summer of 21 in the Anglo-German declaration after that summit. There are a couple of places where the Germans had basically insisted, let us make it perfectly clear, none of this prejudices anything we choose to do with our European partners within the European Union. And it was very, very clear that there were, is there anything like that? I didn't notice anything like that in this declaration. And I think it's quite significant if it's missing in a way.
Can I, Anand, because I completely agree with what Alice just said, and I think for me it struck that it almost feels like France needs to decide what it wants, because in a way there's this whole conversation about EU instruments versus NATO instruments, EU funds versus NATO funds, and there's this whole sort of internal EU, not battle, but heavy discussion about what you do, who you do it with, and stuff like that. And then, so I thought, because I completely agree, I was like, that is so vague. And I read that paragraph twice, trying to dissect what it meant. And I thought, actually, it maybe just proves the fact that, yes, we know how both governments and both countries approach this. This is an attempt to try and kind of meet each other halfway. But I think there's a big question for France that it needs to resolve on how much it's ready to do under NATO and with NATO allies, and what it wants to really push at the EU level, and I think France also needs to communicate that with its other EU member states who are also NATO allies, because I think there is lots of confusion as well across Europe about what France is expecting, but the government knows that. So I suspect we'll see hopefully more clarity over the next couple of months, which would help the next summit as well.
Sorry, Richard.
No, I mean, I think those are all really interesting points, and how much theology is still to be worked through, because I think one of the things we've learned with Ukraine is that there are all sorts of shortcuts and all sorts of ways of working together to make sure that the UK and the EU have been able to get what's necessary into Ukraine. So I think that should be heartening in terms of having trodden some paths, but without underestimating some of the difficulties that may still be there from the particular institutional structures we've got in Brussels with the EDF and no sign of the UK joining the EDA at the moment. But I also wanted to bring in Germany, if I may, because there wasn't anything in the summit declaration, I think, on the E3. The E3 is only mentioned in passing, and I think incorrectly. It's saying Italy's member of the E3, if I read it correctly, in the integrated review refresh. I don't know what that says about institutional memory in the E3. But I did wonder, and this is perhaps also a question back to Peter, is how that side of the triangle fits with the Anglo-French relationship, and whether there are just other places that things are happening more effectively, like the G7 and so on, and the transatlantic quad, which have sort of made the E3 perhaps less significant than it was in the past as a forum for doing things together.
Peter?
So I think that, there's certainly quite a lot of mention of the G7, which is a very, very active forum, as you all know. just as well as I do. There's quite a lot of talk of that, and the G7 has become a place where we've become very, very used to talking to France and Germany, as well as other allies, including Italy. I have to admit, I didn't notice that bit about the integrated review. I'll go back and find it, Richard. But the focus, in a way, it'd be slightly odd if we used a bilateral document with France to talk a lot about Germany. It doesn't mean that we don't have a very active dialogue with Germany, and the signal that we'll be sending through the state visit, which is to France and Germany, the King's undertaking it at the request of the government, that is very, very strong. We're deliberately asking the King, and both of those countries have kindly extended invitations to the King to underline something that should be obvious but needs restating, which is that we want closer ties with two very close neighbours. But I don't find it particularly odd, and I wouldn't read too much into a document that's designed to be us with France that doesn't make much mention of Germany. I think, to be honest, it would be a little bit odd if it was the other way around.
There are a lot of questions coming in, quite a few of them from anonymous. Anonymous, according to my colleague Jill Rutter, means civil servant, but I don't know whether that's true or not. But about whether this sort of paves the way or should pave the way for a security deal with the European Union. Obviously, the Boris Johnson government decided not to pursue negotiations over that. So I suppose there are two questions. One, does this make that sort of deal more likely, do you think? And two, if it does, what would such a deal provide? Does it give us any value added, having that sort of agreement with the European Union as well, or would it? Richard, I'll start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably easier to do things bit by bit, as has already happened with the decision to join the military mobility project for PESCO, and whether you get very much from having a sort of broad overarching deal. I mean, as people on this call know, one of the paradoxes is that perhaps the leastly sort of developed formal agreement on foreign security policy between the EU and a third party is with the US, but it's obviously the deepest and most important relationship. And you can have some, very sort of extensively worked out relationships with third countries set out, as with Canada and others who have a strategic partnership agreement with the EU, but that doesn't necessarily lead to much by way of sort of added value. But colleagues may disagree, but I think a more likely trajectory, and it's obviously Peter's territory, is sort of bit by bit, step by step, rather than going for some sort of realization of what was in the political declaration in terms of the agreement that was envisaged there.
Anyone else want to come on?
Yeah, maybe just to build on that as to, whether this UK-France rapprochement sort of helps or not. I think it does and it doesn't. On the one hand, obviously having better relations and mood with, in particular, the one member state that is very active on this topic helps. Something that was said also in the press conference between President Macron and Rishi Sunak, I think there was a sentence by President Macron about how European strategic autonomy requires a deeper and reinvented relation with the UK. So I think this is sort of an acknowledgement that we need to find the way of working together and of associating the UK with what is a really core strategic objective for France. But then it doesn't, in the sense that, better engagement and willingness with one member state doesn't necessarily change the EU rules and the way the EU works with third states. So obviously France is an influential one, but again, what France does isn't law at the European Commission, contrary to, I think, what some people may think. So I think it doesn't necessarily help when it comes to sort of changing some of the rules that have been established. And again, it doesn't really help in the sense that, the competition when it comes to defense industry doesn't really change. The French, even with the best intentions, still have a red line that EU taxpayers' money cannot go to British defense companies when it comes to the European defense investment programs, the defense fund, etc. So I think both countries agree on the fact that they need to stay engaged to do more together, but it may be more of a sort of small step approach at this stage, and then for both sides, maybe for Paris to sort of think, where is our red line, and do we actually get what we want from it? Because what's been happening is that obviously with the UK out of EU defense initiative, initiatives London is necessarily seeking and shaping alternatives. So we're seeing it at NATO with Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, which the French are not really happy with and see as a competition for the EU. But then the UK is outside of those EU formats and want to work also with the US and with Canada, etc. So you didn't define an in-between. And, these real issues, which I think are sort of core to the Brexit conversation, will not be resolved by the bromance between Rishi Sunak and Emmanuel Macron, and will not be resolved by sort of better relations, because they're sort of quite structural ones. So it may be a better mood, but these issues still need to be sorted out.
Tell me they don't actually say bromance in French.
They say, I think, la bromance, which is even worse than bromance as a concept. So yeah.
Sorry, Peter, you wanted to chip in.
Yeah, just very briefly, just to say that for us, it's very, very much about the things that we want to get done. We start from that proposition rather than the institutions we want to create. I do think that one of the things that came up very, very strongly from this summit, both in the declaration, but actually also in the press conference and in the private conversation between the two leaders, was the salience of Ukraine. We really were sending a message through that summit that we were standing shoulder to shoulder on Ukraine. That is incredibly important. We're at a point where there is war in Europe. We're at a point where the cooperation between us and France on this is absolutely vital, but also actually where the Prime Minister has had really good conversations with Ursula von der Leyen on the subject. And again, there is no distance between them in how they regard that conflict. So that's the proposition from which we start. We're both saying very, very clearly that Russia basically needs to lose in Ukraine, and we need to work together to create the conditions where peace can be most clearly realized in a way that allows Ukraine to determine when and how it negotiates. That is a choice for Ukraine, and both leaders were extremely clear about that. So if you start from that proposition, you can see that actually the cooperation between us is incredibly strong, and then you can explore further down the line what further mechanisms you need to make sure that that is as strong as it possibly can be. But on Ukraine, we agreed to work together on training. That was a very important signal, and to work together on ammunition supply, another very important signal. But most importantly of all, it was absolutely clear to everybody that on this issue, which has not always been the case in the past, we were absolutely seeing eye to eye about the politics of this.
Okay, and someone's just pointed out we didn't really tackle head on the question of the ECHR. I mean, did you get any hints from the French, Peter, that this is something they're watching and a bit concerned about in terms of the future of the bilateral relationship?
I mean, bluntly, no. I mean, not that the French aren't concerned by the ECHR, and not for me to say, but we had very honest discussions in the run-up to the summit about the migration bill. I would just point out that the Prime Minister committed to legislating on migration way back in last September. He actually said he'd do it by the end of January. The reason why it's taken us until this long is because he and the Home Secretary have been very, very careful to make sure that they are doing something which they do believe is not going to violate the ECHR, and that was part of the reason why it took us a little bit longer to get to where we needed to get to on that bill. The coincidence of that with the summit is a coincidence, it's nothing else. But in the kinds of discussions that we can now have with France, we had a very open conversation in the run-up to the summit about what that bill would look like and what it meant for our bilateral cooperation. And at no point in that conversation did France say, we want to do less with you because you're introducing this bill. We both recognize that we've both got a big problem to deal with. And what's so fascinating about this summit is the leaders were very, very clear, this is a partnership.
Okay, and just actually, while I've got you here, Peter, which is a bit of an opportunity, the other thing is, did you get any sense that the French have started thinking ahead to the review of the TCA in 2025-26?
So we didn't really use this summit to talk about that. I mean, that is very, very much an EU thing. I mean, I'm sure that they are, and just as we are, thinking about that. But we absolutely on the TCA want to have a positive agenda with the EU, and I think that the tonality of all of that has definitely changed because of the Windsor framework. So I think you will see that the two sides will be talking about the TCA in the not too distant future, and that's a very good thing. We fully expect that to be a constructive conversation, but no, and in the margins of the summit, we didn't use it for that.
Okay, Richard, I'm going to pick on you very, very quickly. As you pointed out, you're on the payroll. We've had someone saying, could someone please explain the various acronyms that people have been throwing around like confetti? So I thought this would be a great task. Joint Expeditionary Forces and Combined Forces and all. I don't know if you can remember them, but are you able to give us a primer?
I can do and be corrected by people who do this professionally. So which means everybody else on the call apart from me. The JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is the UK and 9 other partners, which are focused on Nordic Baltic security, which has become very active over the last couple of years to try and strive towards being more interoperable, and has if you follow them on social media, I mean, they're extraordinary in terms of the activity that they're engaged in and their way of communicating. So it's a good way to get a feel of it. CJEF is the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, which is one of the joint endeavours between Britain and France to create an arrangement whereby they could rapidly deploy a combined force. I think it originally intended to be a sort of holy operation for others to follow up on, say under the auspices of the UN, for example, or NATO or other organisations, and that leads to as Peter said earlier, an awful lot of training and so on between the two sides to make it sort of intuitive for them to work together. And I guess the good news, bad news story is that there hasn't really been a sort of conflict situation that has been ready-made for using the CJEF so far. So I think the discussion as to whether it's either sort of too big or too small to be used in some of the circumstances that it might be envisaged to be used. My apologies if I used acronyms. I'll try and spell them out in the future.
Superb. You passed that test with flying colours. Go on, Georgie.
I could just say, it wouldn't be a conversation about France if we didn't have acronyms, because that's the one thing I've noticed in France is we use acronyms all the time. So maybe that's kind of a testimony to the subject of the conversation.
I think it's partly France and partly security and defence, isn't it? When you bring the two together, then you're in basically acronym land. So I hope that answered the question about acronyms. There's one really interesting question here, what about people-to-people contacts and the potential coming out of this summit to sort of ease those. I know there's some warm, and if I may say so, Peter, rather vague language about things like school trips and how we intend to sort of look into making them. I wonder whether that can be done bilaterally or whether it's an EU thing first and foremost. But is this something that you think we might be making progress on?
Yes, Anand. So on school trips, the concern on the French side was that for school trips, you have in the past needed passports for children to come to the UK. We've agreed that we're going to look at ways to avoid the use of passports and to allow people to travel on ID cards. So that was a commitment that both sides made at the summit. We want to make sure that school trips from the UK are also easy to France. We don't have quite the same problems. There was also a commitment to examine mobility more broadly. France has concerns about the UK. We have concerns about France too. So we agreed that we would set up a working group for that. And that, for a lot of people, that sounds like sort of diplomatic language for doing absolutely nothing. That's not true in this case. It's absolutely a desire to work through those problems in a practical way and in a reciprocal way. We're pretty practical about it. There are a number of things that we think we can do to make those things easier. We need to work through them, and we need to make sure that they're fair to both sides. But I think it was one of the good results of the summit that we were able to agree to do that.
And just to be clear, can we do that with just France? So say, okay, we'll take
Yes, well, as far as we're concerned, we can do whatever we like. But actually, as far as France is concerned as well, there are issues that we can resolve bilaterally. There are some things where France will say to us it's an EU competence. There are some things that we will say to France, well, is it really an EU competence? Can't you just do that with us? So there is a big conversation to have. Some of it is very technical and very complicated, but there are definitely things that we can work through. And schools is a very clear and practical example. But on schools, we haven't agreed to talk about it. We've agreed to do it.
I don't know about anyone else, but I've in a sense, I've been struck by how easy this has been and how little political pushback we've heard. I mean, it's sort of being sort of slightly critical of the French became something of an article of faith after 2016 for many years. I mean, not just at governmental level, but in the governing party. Have others been similarly surprised that there hasn't been a political reaction to this, or am I just being naive?
No, I agree. And I think this is something that, we were thinking about and discussing before the summit as well. What could come and derail the summit, and what would be the reaction from sort of the domestic side. I think there was always an understanding that this could be a bigger issue on the UK side rather than the French side. Not that Franco-British relations matter less in France, but I think, lots of water under the bridge since Brexit, and it's just not a topic of obsession the same way. I think I wouldn't have been very surprised by maybe some factions of especially the Conservative Party pushing back a bit against this rapprochement, and especially the sort of like love between the two countries, especially right after the Windsor framework, sort of this quite active and visible re-engagement with Europe. So I think that has been positive. I don't think it means there isn't, a maybe slight anti-French feeling that remains, but it was quite positive that it didn't derail the sort of relation between the two countries, and that it didn't come in the way of sort of having to dilute some of the work that the two countries want to do together. And again, I mean, a lot of the topics that are here in the UK-France declaration, but also in the refresh, I think even just the vocabulary, you couldn't have had that a few years ago in terms of things we want to coordinate on, we want to align on, we want to work together on. I think this would have been seen as, selling, betraying Brexit, and really giving up on big commitments for British almost independence. Where I think things have moved on. The war in Ukraine has changed things quite a bit, and I think it's an easier framework now where to navigate. And there is a clear case to say working with European partners is good for the UK. And I think this has been a bit depoliticized, but I don't know if colleagues agree.
Richard, were you
I agree with everything that Alice has said, and I'd just add that it seems the Sunak team seems to be much better at their choreography of events, and we both with the Windsor framework, the summit in Paris, but also with the AUKUS announcement and the integrated review refresh. I mean, I think the pitch is slightly better rolled than has been the case in the past. But of course, there is the scope for a huge disagreement with this France-UK Literary Prize, which is promised in the declaration. You can imagine that really is going to cause some cross-channel tension, can't you?
Georgie.
I just want to sort of build on that, because I think on the connection point, I think that was on the French side was really, really important. There was this sense that actually our societies are just not connected as they used to be. And that's partly because of Brexit, but also because of COVID and fewer opportunities. And so, enabling a whole class to go for 2 weeks on a trip to the UK, for practical reasons, if one student of the class didn't have a passport, that meant that the whole class couldn't go. So I think it's about people-to-people contacts. It's about building links between museums. It's about building links between artists. It's about, twinning cities and everything else. And I think also the business environment, there's a big piece in there about, we have like very businesses, big businesses in both countries that operate in both countries, and so enabling that and continuing to foster that is really, really important. And I think, if that comes out and if we manage to make progress on that between now and the next summit, I think that will be a really good thing for the two countries, because a lot of the time we think we understand each other, but we don't, and we should spend more time in each other's countries to really understand what we're going through.
Excellent. Well, on that note, we have run out of time. We've gone straight to 2 o'clock. So without further ado, let me thank Richard, Georgie, Alice, and particularly you, Peter. You should probably be on leave this week, really, shouldn't you, after your efforts last week? But thank you so much for sparing us the time today. I think this has been absolutely fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. Hope you have too. And for the rest of you, we will see you in a couple of weeks. I would announce what the next one is, but I've forgotten, but it will be in a couple of weeks. So we look forward to seeing you all then. Take care. Thanks ever so much, Jeff. Oh, finally, I'm getting a note here to say, for those of you interested, on the 22nd of March, we've got an in-person event where we're going to debate the economic impacts of Brexit, which should be quite interesting. Should be quite stroppy as well, quite possibly. But anyway, I hope we see as many of you as possible then in person on the 22nd of March. But until